what the conversation would turn out to be. But every other time when I came and I was in trouble, he would always help me. Sometimes, that was it from, what's his name? Lou. Sometimes other young men would come with scholarly presentations to test the Swami's knowledge of Bhagavad Gita. And Prabhupada would say to them, "You have read the Gita? What is your conclusion? If you claim to know the Gita, then you should know what is the conclusion of the Gita." But most people didn't even think that there was a conclusion. And even if there were such a conclusion, it didn't mean that they were supposed to arrange their life around it. So their reading of Gita, Bhagavad Gita, was just a casual thing. Once, when a young man approached the Swami asking, "What book will you lecture on? What book will you lecture from next week? Will you be teaching the Tibetan Book of the Dead?" That's a famous book that was circulating in the 60s. He asked this question to Prabhupada as if Prabhupada would teach spirituality like a college survey course in world religions. But Prabhupada said to him, "Everything is there in the Bhagavad Gita. We could study one verse for 3 months. In other words, he could unpack one Sanskrit verse for 3 months, explaining each word." There were other questions. Someone asked, "What about Camus?" Camus, he's a French? Camus. He's a French philosopher. And Prabhupada would ask, when someone asked him, "What about Camus?" Prabhupada would ask, "What is his philosophy?" And the person said, "Well, Camus says everything is absurd. And the only philosophical question is whether to commit suicide." Prabhupada responded to this, "That means everything is absurd for him." The material world is absurd, but there is a spiritual world beyond this world. And that means that he does not know the soul. He doesn't know that the soul cannot be killed. This is knowledge from Bhagavad Gita. Nahanyate hanyamani sharire. Krishna says, for the soul, there is no such thing as birth or death. He is eternal, and he never ceases to be. This knowledge was not available. So Prabhupada said, continuing, there were adherents of various thinkers who approached Prabhupada. Someone asked, "What about Nietzsche and Kafka and Timothy Leary?" Timothy Leary is the man who introduced LSD. Yeah. So he was like a guru in the 60s. So they asked him, "What about him?" And what about Bob Dylan?
Bob Dylan.
He's probably the best of the lot. Prabhupada would ask, when they presented these names, he would ask them always, what is their philosophy? And the particular follower who was asking about this, they wouldn't be able to explain what is the philosophy of the person they're asking about. When he asked, when Prabhupada said, what is their philosophy? They would have to explain the philosophy of that person and defend their philosophy. But Prabhupada would say, these people are all mental speculators. Here in this material world, we are all conditioned souls. And so, your knowledge is imperfect. Your senses are blunt. So what good is your opinion? We have to hear from the perfect authority. If we want perfect knowledge, we have to hear from the perfect authority. And the perfect authority is Krishna. One boy asked, do you mean to say that none of these great thinkers are God? Or are God conscious? And Prabhupada says, their sincerity is their God consciousness. If they have God consciousness, would be the proof of their sincerity. But if we want perfect knowledge of God, then we have to consult the scriptures. Often there were challenges, but under the Swami's stare and his hard logic, the challenges would usually trail off into thoughtful silence. This is the first time they had met someone who could show and dismantle all these half-baked philosophies and ideas. Someone asked him once, is the spiritual knowledge of China advanced? And when someone asks questions like that, Prabhupada would just be silent, making a sour face. What's a sour face? Then someone says, well, I am a follower of Vedanta. Now they're coming into Eastern thought. I am a follower of Vedanta myself. And Prabhupada says, do you know what Vedanta is? What is the first aphorism of Vedanta? Do you know? And they would say, no. They really didn't know. They just heard these things. But they weren't educated in Eastern philosophy, really. But they would drop these words like Bhagavad Gita and Vedanta and so on. But really they hadn't taken the time to study. Nor was there anyone else that they could go and study from. You know, in all the universities, there was no course offered on studying Vedanta. Vedanta, of course, means, Veda means knowledge, and Anta means the end or the conclusion. This is a work of Vyas, who is the compiler of all the Vedas. He did like a condensed, after writing all the Vedas, he wrote Vedanta Sutra, which was giving the same knowledge that he had given, but in short little aphorisms, which would need to be unpacked, you know? So they didn't know what was that. But Prabhupada had studied Vedanta, and Prabhupada was coming in a line of spiritual teachers who understood Vedanta. So Prabhupada, when the person says, when Prabhupada asked them, do you know what is Vedanta? And they said, no, I do not. And Prabhupada said, then how you can speak of Vedanta? You don't know what it is. Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Vedais cha savai aham eva vedya. Means, Krishna is saying that he is the goal of Vedanta. So if you are a Vedantist, then you must become Krishna conscious. Well, what about Buddha? See, they knew of all these names, of these personalities, but they really don't have an understanding of them, or who they are. One good thing about the 60s is people were curious. They were turning to the East. They weren't just, many young people, they were not satisfied with what was handed to them, what was given to them, namely some form of Christianity. So they were looking elsewhere. But without guidance, they couldn't really get a hold, grasp what these personalities like Buddha and others, what is their philosophy, what is their teachings. But you can see how Krishna is guiding as this super soul. If someone is seeking, Krishna will guide him to a proper person who can explain. So somehow or other, they are being guided to come to Prabhupada. So this fellow said, continues, what about Buddha? Prabhupada said, do you follow him? No. So they don't know. So Prabhupada said, no, you don't follow him, you just talk. But why don't you follow him? Follow somebody. Follow Krishna, follow Christ, follow Buddha. But don't just talk. The fellow said, this sounds the same as Christianity. How is it different? Prabhupada says, it is the same. It is love of God. But who is a Christian? Who is a Christian? Who is following him? Who is following Christ? The Bible teaches that thou shalt not kill. But all over the world, the Christians are very expert in killing. It means killing animals. Do you know that? I believe the Christians say that Jesus Christ died for our sins, so why are you still sinning? Although Prabhupada was a stranger to America, these young people, they were strangers to the absolute truth. Whenever anyone would come to see him, he wouldn't waste time. He would get right to the heart of the matter. He would speak philosophy, reason, and argument. He constantly argued against atheism and impersonalism. He spoke strongly to prove the existence of God and the universality of Krishna consciousness. He would talk often, vigorously, day and night, meeting all kinds of questions and philosophers. He would listen also, and so he heard a wide range of local testimonies. He heard the dissatisfaction of young Americans about the war. This was the Vietnam War. This was the first war where America was divided. Half the people were against it. Half of the population in America thought this is wrong. We have no business in this war. We should get out of it. And the other half, they supported the government. This was the 60s. So many young people this was a big issue for them. They were against the war. One boy told him that he wanted to get married, but he couldn't find a chaste girl. So he thought it was better to go with prostitutes. Another boy confided that his mother had planned to abort him, because abortion was on the rise in the 60s. He said his mother had planned to abort him, but at the last moment his grandmother convinced her not to do so. Prabhupada heard about homosexuals. That was also on the rise in America. Someone told him there was also a set of New Yorkers who considered it chic or hip to eat the flesh of aborted babies. That was another group. And in every case, Prabhupada would simply tell them the truth. He talked with Marxists and explained that although Marx says that everything is the property of the state, the fact is that everything is the property of God. So only spiritual communism, which puts God in the center, can actually be successful. Prabhupada discounted LSD and the visions and hallucinations that people got by taking LSD. He explained, how can God be seen factually? And what God looks like? Although these one-time visitors came and went, a few new ones began to stay on, watching the Swami deal with different guests. They began to appreciate the Swami's arguments, his concern for people, and his devotion to Krishna. He seemed actually to know how to help people, and he invariably offered them Krishna consciousness, as much as they could take. Remember, he's carrying within his heart all the wisdom of the Vedas. But who can take it? How much can they take? So, a few people began to take the Swami's message to heart. And we've come to the end of one section. Next section is the ISKCON, how it began. Prabhupada came up with this, what's it called, an acronym. ISKCON stands for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. As people becoming serious and coming to hear regularly, he thought, now is the time. And he registered as a society. He said to the people there, we shall call our society ISKCON. Prabhupada had laughed playfully when he first came up with this term, ISKCON. He liked it. Shall I finish this little part?
Yes.
Okay. He had initiated the legal work of incorporation during the spring, while he was still living on the Bowery, 26 2nd Avenue. But even before its legal beginning, he was always talking about his International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And so, it had appeared in letters to India, and in the Village Voice, which was a local newspaper. A friend had suggested a title that would sound more familiar to Westerners. This friend told Prabhupada, why not call it the International Society for God Consciousness? Not Krishna consciousness, but God consciousness. But Prabhupada insisted, no. God is a vague term. It's a vague term. Whereas Krishna was exact and scientific. God consciousness, the term God consciousness, was spiritually weaker, less personal. And if Westerners didn't know that Krishna was God, then the International Society for Krishna Consciousness would tell them by spreading his glories in every town and village. So Krishna consciousness was Prabhupada's rendering of a phrase given a few hundred years ago by Rupa Goswami. He had written a book called Bhakti Rasamrita, and he said he had written that Bhakti Rasa means to be absorbed in the mellow or taste of executing devotional service to Krishna. So it's from that Prabhupada got Krishna consciousness. But to register ISKCON legally as a non-profit tax-exempt religion required money and a lawyer. Carl, who was Carl again? Carl, one of the early ones. Carl Jurgens we read about him earlier, he was one of the regulars coming. Carl Jürgens had already gained some experience in forming religious, political, social welfare groups when he had met Prabhupada in the Bari. So he agreed to help. He contacted his lawyer, a fellow named Stephen Goldsmith. Stephen Goldsmith was a young Jewish lawyer with a wife and 2 children, and he had an office on Park Avenue. When Carl told him about Prabhupada's plans, he was immediately fascinated, the lawyer. He was immediately fascinated by the idea of setting up a religious corporation for an Indian Swami. So he came and visited Prabhupada at 26 2nd Avenue, and they discussed incorporation, tax exemption, Prabhupada's immigration status, and Krishna consciousness. Mr. Goldsmith visited Prabhupada several times. One time he brought his children, who liked the soup that the Swami had cooked and offered them. Prabhupada made some dal. And the man's children loved it. Mr. Goldsmith began attending the evening lectures, where he was often the only non-hippie person there. He was a lawyer, and he had an office on Park Avenue, which is like uptown, upscale, you know? So him coming down to the Bari, it's going down the lower east side. But he was coming because his friend, Carl, told him there's an Indian Swami who wants to get his society registered. So, he was the only non-hippie member of the congregation. One evening, having completed all the legal groundwork, and ready to complete the procedures for incorporation, Mr. Goldsmith came to Prabhupada's lecture and kirtan to get signatures from the trustees, from those followers. They were to be the first trustees of ISKCON. So, we shall stop there for today. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So today it is kirtan beginning from 11 o'clock until tonight, non-stop. So you're all invited to come and take as much as you like. Yes. There'll be a feast cooked today also. But there'll be chanting, kirtan going on in the temple room from 11 o'clock until 7, 8 o'clock tonight. I'll be coming in to chant around 12:30. And if there are anyone who wants to chant, Vidur, I believe, is compiling a list, schedule, someone wants to chant for half an hour, or whatever. I'll be chanting for about an hour, from 12:30 to 1:30. What time is the feast usually served on Sunday? 2 o'clock. So, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Haribol.